The nursery reeked of lavender oil and desperation. Alara had been kneeling on the cold stone floor for what felt like hours, her knees numb and her back aching in that dull, persistent way that came from a lifetime of labor no one bothered to notice. She'd learned early that invisibility was a kind of survival, that if she kept her head down, her voice soft, her presence forgettable, the world might let her pass through it without harm. But tonight, invisibility had betrayed her. Tonight, she'd been summoned. The boys won't stop crying. The head housekeeper had barked at her, shoving a bundle of linens into her arms. Every wet nurse we've brought in has failed. You're the last option. If you can't calm them, I don't know what we'll do. Alara hadn't asked why she was the last option. She never asked questions. Questions invited attention, and attention invited pain. So she'd taken the linens, climbed the winding staircase to the east wing, where servants like her were never allowed, and pushed open the heavy oak door to find chaos incarnate. 2 infants, no older than 6 months, wailed in their cradles with a fury that seemed impossible for such small bodies to contain. Their cries were sharp and relentless, piercing the air like knives, and the room itself seemed to vibrate with their distress. The wet nurses who'd been dismissed stood huddled near the door, their faces pale and their hands trembling, as if the children's screams had physically wounded them. Alara had barely glanced at them before they fled, leaving her alone with the boys. She set the linens down and approached the first cradle slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The baby inside was red-faced and furious, his tiny fists clenched as if he were fighting an invisible enemy. His brother, in the cradle beside him, was no better. His screams were hoarser, raw, as though he'd been crying for days. Alara's hand shook as she reached for the first child, lifting him with the careful precision of someone who knew how fragile life could be. The moment her arms closed around him, something shifted. The baby's cries didn't stop immediately, but they softened, breaking into stuttering hiccups as he turned his face into her shoulder. Alara froze, hardly daring to breathe. She'd never held a child before, had never been trusted with something so precious, and the weight of him against her chest was both terrifying and strangely grounding. He was warm, so warm, and he smelled like milk and something else, something wilder, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she couldn't name. "Shh," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Shh, little one, I'm here." She rocked him gently, swaying on her feet in the rhythm her own mother had used with her, back when she'd still had a mother, back when the world had been smaller and kinder. The baby's cries faded into whimpers, then into silence. His tiny hand curled around a lock of her hair, tugging with surprising strength, and Alara felt something crack open inside her chest, something she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten it was there. The second baby was still screaming. Alara moved to his cradle, still holding his brother, and somehow managed to lift him as well. It was awkward, ungainly, but she made it work. She held them both against her, one on each arm, and they quieted almost instantly. Their small bodies relaxed into hers, their breathing evening out, as if her presence alone was enough to soothe whatever storm had been raging inside them. For a long moment, Alara simply stood there, holding them, feeling the weight of their trust settle over her like a mantle she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The room was silent now, save for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth and the boys' gentle breathing. She should have felt triumph. She'd succeeded where others had failed, but all she felt was a strange, aching tenderness that terrified her more than any punishment ever had. She didn't notice the door opening, didn't hear the footsteps that crossed the room with the quiet, predatory grace of something that didn't need to announce itself. She only realized she wasn't alone when a voice, low, rough, and carrying the weight of absolute authority, spoke from behind her. "Who are you?" Alara's entire body went rigid. The baby stirred slightly in her arms, sensing her sudden tension, but they didn't cry. She turned slowly, her heart slamming against her ribs, and found herself staring at a man who didn't belong in the same world as her. He was tall, so tall that he seemed to fill the doorway even though he stood several feet inside the room. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the firelight, casting his face into shadow, but even in the dim light, she could see the sharp lines of his jaw, the cold, assessing gleam of his eyes. He wore black, everything black, from his tunic to his boots, and the air around him seemed heavier, denser, as if the room itself bent to his presence. This was no ordinary man. Alara didn't need to be told. She could feel it in the way her instincts screamed at her to run, in the way her body refused to move, frozen under the weight of his gaze. This was someone dangerous, someone powerful, someone who could crush her without a second thought. I'm Alara, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The housekeeper sent me. The boys, they wouldn't stop crying. His gaze dropped to the infants in her arms, and something flickered across his face, something too fast for her to read. He moved closer and Alara's breath caught. He smelled like pine and smoke and something darker, something that made her skin prickle with awareness. When he reached out, she flinched, but he wasn't reaching for her. He was reaching for one of the boys. His hand hovered over the baby's head for a moment, hesitant, and then he pulled back, his jaw tightening. They've been crying for 3 days, he said, his voice flat. No one could calm them, not the wet nurses, not the healers, no one. Alara swallowed hard. I don't know why they stopped for me. His eyes snapped to hers, and she felt the force of his attention like a physical blow. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't just dark, they were gold. Molten gold, like the heart of a fire, and they burned with an intensity that made her want to look away, to shrink back into the safety of invisibility. But she couldn't. She was trapped, pinned under the weight of his stare, and something deep inside her whispered that everything had just changed. What's your name? He asked again, as if he hadn't heard her the first time. Alara, she repeated, her voice steadier now. Just Alara. Just Alara, he echoed, and there was something strange in the way he said it. Something that made her stomach twist. He stepped closer, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Do you know who I am? She shook her head, though a horrible suspicion was beginning to take root in her mind. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm Kaelin, and those, he said, gesturing to the babies in her arms, are my sons. The words hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. His sons, these tiny, perfect creatures she held against her chest, were the children of the man standing before her. A man whose very presence made the air feel too thin to breathe. Alara's mind raced, trying to reconcile what she knew of the castle's hierarchy with the reality now staring her down. She was a servant. Less than that, really. A body to scrub floors and empty chamber pots, invisible to everyone who mattered. And yet here she stood, in the private nursery of the East Wing, holding the children of someone who could only be. You're the Alpha King, she whispered, the realization hitting her like a fist to the stomach. Kaelin's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous that made her pulse jump. I am, he said simply, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. And you, just Alara, have done what no one else could, which means you're going to stay. The words didn't register at first. Stay, as if it were a request, not a command, but the way he said it, the way his voice wrapped around the syllables with an authority that brooked no argument, made it clear there was no choice involved. Alara's arms tightened instinctively around the babies, and she felt their small bodies shift against her, warm and trusting and utterly dependent. Stay? She echoed, her voice barely audible. I don't understand. Kaelin moved closer, and Alara's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She took a step back, her spine pressing against the edge of the second cradle, and the movement made one of the babies, she didn't know which, let out a soft whimper. Kaelin froze mid-step, his gaze dropping to the child in her arms, and for a moment, something almost like pain crossed his face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same cold, unreadable mask. They need you, he said, and there was an edge to his voice now, something raw beneath the surface. I don't know why. I don't care why. But they've been inconsolable since their mother died 3 days ago, and you're the only person who's been able to calm them. So yes, you're staying. The words hit her like a physical blow. Their mother died 3 days ago. Alara's throat tightened, and she looked down at the babies in her arms, at their soft, sleeping faces, and felt a wave of grief so sharp it stole her breath. These children were motherless. And their father, this cold, terrifying man who commanded kingdoms and bent the world to his will, was standing here in the middle of the night, looking at them as if they were both his greatest treasure and his deepest wound. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate and small. "I'm so sorry." Kalen's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might say something, might acknowledge the grief that hung in the room like a living thing. But he didn't. Instead, he turned away, his broad shoulders rigid, and moved toward the window. The moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face, and Alara realized with a jolt that he was younger than she'd thought. Not much older than her, perhaps, 30 at most. But there was something ancient in his eyes, something that spoke of burdens no one should carry alone. "You'll sleep here," he said without turning around. "In the adjoining chamber. The boys will need you through the night. Every night." Alara's breath caught. Every night. The East Wing, the Alpha King's private quarters. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. This was... "I can't," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm just a servant. I don't belong here. Someone else, someone trained." "There is no one else." His voice cut through her protest like a knife, sharp and final. He turned to face her, and the full weight of his attention made her knees weak. "You think I haven't tried? I've brought in wet nurses from every pack within 100 miles, healers, midwives, women who've raised a dozen children of their own. None of them could do what you just did. None of them could make my son stop screaming long enough to take a breath." He took a step toward her, then another, and Alara found herself unable to move, unable to do anything but stand there and watch him approach like a storm rolling in over the horizon. When he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, and gods, he was so warm, impossibly warm, like standing too close to a fire. He stopped. His gaze dropped to the babies in her arms, then rose slowly to meet hers, and Alara felt something shift in the air between them. Something electric, something that made her skin prickle and her heart stutter in her chest. "What are you?" he asked, his voice so low it was almost a growl. "Human?" Alara blinked, confusion cutting through the fog of fear and exhaustion. "Of course I'm human. What else would I be?" Kalen's eyes narrowed, and he leaned in, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his irises, close enough that his scent surrounded her like a physical presence, pine and smoke and something wild, something that made her think of moonlit forests and predators moving through the dark. Her pulse kicked into overdrive, and she felt the strange, irrational urge to lean into him, to close the distance between them and... "You don't smell human," he said, and there was an accusation in his tone, as if she'd lied to him. "You smell like..." He trailed off, his expression shifting into something she couldn't read. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his gaze roaming over her face as if searching for answers written in her features. Alara's breath came in shallow bursts, and she realized with a start that her hands were trembling. The baby stirred in her arms, sensing her distress, and she forced herself to take a slow, steadying breath. "I don't know what you mean," she said quietly. "I've always been human. Just a servant." Kalen pulled back slightly, his jaw working as if he were grinding his teeth. "Maybe," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe you're something else entirely, and you just don't know it yet." Before she could respond, before she could even begin to process what he just said, he turned and strode toward the door. His movements were fluid, graceful in a way that didn't quite match his size, and Alara found herself watching the way his muscles shifted beneath his tunic, the way he carried himself like a man who'd never had to justify his presence in any room. He paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the door frame, and looked back at her over his shoulder. "The adjoining chamber is through that door," he said, nodding toward a small archway she hadn't noticed before. "You'll find everything you need. If the boys wake, tend to them. If you need anything..." "I won't," she said quickly, desperate to avoid prolonging this conversation, this impossible situation. Kalen's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but there was no humor in it. "We'll see." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Alara stood there in the sudden silence, her heart still racing, her arms aching from the weight of the babies she refused to put down. She looked down at them, at their tiny, peaceful faces, and felt the enormity of what had just happened crash over her like a wave. She was trapped, bound to this place, to these children, to a man whose very existence defied everything she thought she knew about the world. And worst of all, some traitorous part of her, the part that had leaned toward him, that had breathed in his scent like it was air, didn't want to leave. The boys shifted in her arms, and one of them opened his eyes. They were gold, just like his father's. The adjoining chamber was small, but finer than any room Alara had ever slept in. A narrow bed stood against one wall, covered in linens that looked soft enough to be sinful. A wash basin sat on a wooden stand, and beside it, a chair worn smooth by use. Moonlight spilled through a single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Alara laid the babies in their cradles with a gentleness that surprised her. They didn't wake, their small chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm, and she stood there for a long moment just watching them. They were beautiful, heartbreakingly so. Dark hair like their father's, skin so soft it seemed impossible. And those eyes, when the one had opened them, gold and ancient and far too knowing for an infant. She backed away slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace, and retreated into her new chamber. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and only then did she allow herself to collapse onto the bed. Her legs gave out, her body trembling with exhaustion and something else, something that felt dangerously like fear. What had she done? What had she agreed to? She hadn't agreed to anything, she reminded herself. Kaelin hadn't asked. He'd commanded, and she'd had no choice but to obey. That was the way of the world. Servants didn't refuse kings. They certainly didn't refuse alpha kings, men who could shift into wolves the size of horses, who ruled with absolute authority, who were said to be able to smell lies and fear and desire. Desire. Alara's face burned at the thought. She pressed her hands to her cheeks, feeling the heat there, and cursed herself for the way her body had reacted to him. The way her pulse had jumped when he'd leaned close, the way his scent had made her want to close her eyes and breathe deeper. It was madness. He was the Alpha King. She was nothing, less than nothing. And yet, sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams she couldn't quite remember. When she woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the window, and she could hear soft whimpering from the nursery. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, stumbling through the door to find one of the boys awake and fussing. She scooped him up automatically, rocking him against her chest, and his cries subsided into contented gurgles. "You're hungry," she murmured, though she had no idea how she knew. The knowledge simply settled into her bones, certain and absolute. A wet nurse arrived moments later, a plump woman with kind eyes who looked relieved to find the baby calm. "Thank the gods," she breathed. "I'm Marta. They told me you'd be here." Alara handed the boy over carefully, watching as Marta settled into the rocking chair to feed him. "What are their names?" she asked quietly. Marta's expression softened. "The king hasn't named them yet. Tradition says he can't until their mother's mourning period ends. 7 days. She paused, then added gently, "The queen was kind. We all miss her." Alara wanted to ask more, wanted to know what had happened, how a queen could die so suddenly. But the look on Marta's face stopped her. Some grief was too fresh to speak aloud. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Alara woke when the boys woke, soothed them when they cried, held them when they needed holding. She saw Marta and other servants, but Kaelin remained absent, a ghost haunting his own castle. She told herself she was relieved, told herself his absence made everything easier. She was lying. On the third night, she woke to find him standing in the nursery. He was silhouetted against the window, his back to her, and for a moment she thought she'd imagined him. But then he moved, turning slightly, and moonlight caught the sharp angle of his jaw. "They're sleeping," she said softly, though it was obvious. "I know." His voice was rough, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "I can hear their heartbeats. both of them, steady and strong. Alara stepped into the room fully, suddenly aware that she wore only her thin nightgown. She crossed her arms over her chest, feeling exposed. They're healthy, growing stronger every day. Kaelin finally turned to face her, and even in the darkness, she could see the exhaustion etched into his features. Because of you. I'm just doing what anyone would. No. The word was sharp, cutting through her protest. Not anyone, you. He moved toward her, and Alara's breath caught. Do you have any idea how strange this is? How impossible? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Shifter infants bond with their pack, he said, stopping just out of reach. With their blood family, not with strangers, especially not with humans. His eyes narrowed. And yet my sons respond to you as if you're their mother. The word mother hit her like a physical blow. I'm not! I know what you're not. He took another step closer, and suddenly the space between them felt like nothing at all. What I don't know is what you are. His scent surrounded her, pine and smoke and moonlight, and Alara felt her knees weaken. This close, she could see the gold in his eyes wasn't uniform. It swirled and shifted like molten metal, hypnotic and terrifying and beautiful. Tell me, Alara. His voice dropped to a whisper. Why do you smell like Peck? I don't know what you mean, Alara whispered. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded like a lie. Because something inside her did know, something deep and buried and screaming to be acknowledged. Kaelin's hand came up slowly, and she thought he might touch her face. Instead, his fingers stopped inches from her cheek, hovering in the space between them. Your scent changed when I got close, he said, his voice barely audible. Your pulse is racing, and your eyes. My eyes are brown, she interrupted, desperate to break whatever spell was weaving itself around them. Just brown, human. They were brown, he agreed, a moment ago. Alara's blood went cold. What? He stepped back abruptly, and the loss of his proximity felt like a physical ache. Go back to bed, he said, his tone suddenly formal, distant. The boys will wake soon. Wait, what did you mean about my eyes? But he was already moving toward the door, his movement sharp and controlled. Sleep, Alara. We'll talk when the mourning period ends. And then he was gone again, leaving her alone with 2 sleeping infants and a terror that felt like it might consume her whole. The next 3 days passed in agonizing slowness. Alara caught herself checking her reflection in the wash basin, staring at her eyes until they watered, searching for any sign of the change Kaelin claimed to have seen. But they remained stubbornly, ordinarily brown. Human eyes, normal eyes. Except nothing felt normal anymore. The boys grew stronger under her care, their cries less frequent, their smiles, when they came, bright enough to break her heart. She learned to tell them apart by the tiny birthmark on the younger one's left shoulder, by the way the elder always woke first. She sang to them in a language she didn't remember learning, lullabies that felt older than memory. Marta watched her sometimes, with an expression Alara couldn't decipher. Not suspicion exactly. Something closer to recognition. On the 7th day, Alara woke to find the castle in motion. Servants hurried through corridors with armfuls of black cloth. The mourning period was ending. Tonight, the Alpha King would name his sons and formally present them to the pack. You'll attend, Marta informed her, as she helped Alara into a dress that was far too fine for a servant. Midnight blue with silver threading, it fit her perfectly despite her never being measured. The king's orders. I can't, Alara protested. I'm not pack. I'm not. He wants you there. Marta's hands were gentle but firm as she braided Alara's hair. The boys will need you. The great hall was already filled when they arrived, dozens of shifters standing in clusters, their voices a low murmur that felt like thunder. Alara clutched the elder boy against her chest while a nurse carried his brother, and every eye in the room turned toward them as they entered. The weight of their stares was crushing. She could feel their assessment, their confusion. A human holding the Alpha King's heir, it was unprecedented, possibly blasphemous. Kaelin stood at the far end of the hall on a raised dais, and even across the distance, Alara felt the force of his presence. He wore black still, but formal now, a tunic embroidered with silver wolves that caught the torchlight. His hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp architecture of his face, and his eyes, those impossible golden eyes, found hers immediately. Something passed between them, a recognition that made her skin prickle and her breath catch. The ceremony began with words in a language Alara didn't know, ancient and guttural. Kaelin's voice carried through the hall with effortless authority as he spoke of loss and legacy, of the line continuing despite tragedy. And then he gestured, and Alara found herself moving forward as if pulled by invisible strings. She climbed the steps to the dais on shaking legs, the baby's weight both an anchor and a lifeline. The nurse followed with his brother. Up close, Kaelin looked carved from stone, beautiful and cold and utterly untouchable. "These are my sons," he announced to the gathered pack. "Born of Queen Lyanna, blessed by the moon, heirs to the Northern Territory." He took the elder boy from Alara's arms, and she felt the loss like a wound, but then his hand brushed hers, just the briefest contact, and electricity shot through her body so intensely she nearly gasped. His eyes snapped to hers, wide with shock. He'd felt it too. "This one," he said, his voice rougher now. "I named Torin, strong as the mountain." He handed Torin back to her, and their fingers touched again. The same shock, the same impossible current. Kaelin took the second boy, his movements mechanical now, his expression carefully blank. "This one I name Ren, fierce as the wolf." The pack erupted in ceremonial howls, a sound that should have been terrifying but instead felt like coming home. Alara stood frozen on the dais, holding Torin, feeling the vibrations of the howls in her bones, and knew with absolute certainty that her life had just fractured into before and after. When the noise finally died, Kaelin turned to her. His voice was meant only for her ears. "Don't leave. We need to talk." "About what?" His jaw tightened. "About why you felt that. About why—" He stopped, shook his head. "Just don't leave." The hall emptied slowly, pack members filing past to bow their heads toward the twins before departing. Alara stood rigid on the dais, Torin sleeping against her shoulder, feeling like an imposter in borrowed finery. When the last shifter finally left, the silence was deafening. Kaelin handed Ren to Marta with quiet instructions, then turned to Alara. "Give me Torin." She hesitated, her arms tightening instinctively around the baby. The thought of letting him go felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain, but Kaelin was waiting, his expression unreadable, so she carefully transferred the sleeping infant into his arms. The moment her hands were empty, she felt untethered, lost. Kaelin passed Torin to another nurse who'd been waiting in the shadows, and suddenly they were alone. The great hall felt cavernous around them, the torchlight casting long shadows that danced across stone walls. Kaelin's gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to flee. "Come with me," he said, and it wasn't a request. He led her through corridors she'd never seen, deeper into the castle's private wings. They passed guards who straightened at his approach, their eyes sliding over Alara with barely concealed curiosity. Finally, Kaelin pushed open a heavy door and gestured her inside. The room was clearly his personal study. Books lined the walls, maps covered a massive oak desk, and a fire crackled in the hearth. The scent of him was everywhere. Pine and smoke, and something wild that made her dizzy. Kaelin closed the door behind them, and the soft click of the lock sliding home made Alara's pulse jump. "Sit," he said, nodding toward one of the chairs near the fire. She sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and watched as he paced the length of the room. His movements were restless, almost agitated, and she realized with a start that she'd never seen him anything but perfectly controlled before. "I need you to answer something honestly," he said finally, stopping to face her. "Have you ever experienced anything unusual? Moments where your senses were too sharp, where you could hear things you shouldn't be able to hear, or smell things others couldn't?" Alara's throat went dry. Sometimes. I thought everyone." "They don't." He moved closer, crouching down so they were eye level. This close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw was shadowed with stubble. What about anger? Have you ever lost your temper and felt something shift inside you, something animal? She thought of the night 3 years ago when a merchant had grabbed her wrist, his intentions clear. She'd shoved him, and he'd flown backward into a wall with enough force to crack the stone. Everyone had said he'd slipped, that she couldn't possibly have that kind of strength. She'd believed them because the alternative was impossible. Once, she whispered, maybe. Kaylin's eyes closed briefly, and when they opened, there was something like resignation in them. You're not human, Alara. Or, not entirely. The words hung between them, impossible and absolute. That's not. I can't be. You are. His voice was gentle now, almost careful. I don't know how you've gone this long without knowing, but I'd stake my throne on it. You're Shifter. Probably dormant, which is rare but not unheard of. Something about my sons triggered your awakening. Alara's hands were shaking. But my parents were human, I'm certain. Are you? Kaylin reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, and took one of her trembling hands in his. The contact sent that same electric shock through her system, but this time he didn't pull away. His thumb stroked over her knuckles, and she felt the touch everywhere. Because Shifter bloodlines can hide for generations, all it takes is the right catalyst. The boys, she breathed. The boys, he confirmed. My sons recognize what you were before you did. That's why they calmed for you, why they bond with you like pack. Alara tried to pull her hand back, but Kaylin's grip tightened, not painfully, but firmly enough that she couldn't escape. I don't want this, she said, hearing the panic in her own voice. I don't want to be. You don't have a choice. His free hand came up to cup her face, and she froze. His palm was warm against her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle for someone so dangerous. None of us do. We don't choose what we are, Alara. We only choose what we do with it. She should move away, should put distance between them before this, whatever this was, went somewhere irreversible. But his scent was drowning her, his touch making her feel like her skin was too tight. And when his thumb brushed across her lower lip, she heard herself make a sound that was half gasp, half surrender. Kaylin. The door burst open with a crash that made them both jolt apart. A man strode in, tall, dark-haired, with eyes that glowed amber in the firelight. His gaze swept the room, landing on Alara with an expression of pure contempt before shifting to Kaylin. So the rumors are true, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. The Alpha King takes a human servant to raise his heirs while his mate's body is barely cold. Kaylin was on his feet instantly, his body positioned between Alara and the intruder. The temperature in the room dropped, and Alara felt something radiating off him. Power, barely leashed and utterly lethal. Careful, Vaughn, Kaylin said softly. You're already walking a thin line. Vaughn's smile was all teeth. Am I? Or am I simply saying what the entire pack is thinking? His gaze slid past Kaylin to Alara. She's not one of us. She has no right to. She has every right I give her. Kaylin's voice was glacial. And you have no right to question me. I have the right of challenge. Vaughn's words fell like stones into still water. Ancient law. If you're unfit to lead, if you've been compromised by a human, then I can challenge for your throne. The silence that followed was absolute. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Kaylin's shoulders tense, watched his hands curl into fists at his sides. You want to challenge me? Kaylin asked, his tone almost conversational. You think you can take what's mine? Vaughn's smile widened. I know I can. The challenge hung in the air like a blade. Alara watched as Kaylin's entire body went still, not the stillness of calm, but of a predator deciding whether to strike. The firelight caught the gold in his eyes, and for a moment they seemed to glow. 3 days, Kaylin said quietly. That's the traditional waiting period. You have 3 days to reconsider this stupidity. Vaughn's laugh was harsh. I won't need them. The pack deserves better than a king who dishonors his mate's memory by playing house with a human whore. Kaylin moved faster than Alara could track. One moment he was standing still, the next his hand was wrapped around Vaughn's throat, slamming him against the wall with enough force to crack the stone. The sound Kaelin made wasn't quite human. A growl that vibrated through the room and made every instinct in Alara's body scream danger. "Say that word again," Kaelin whispered, his face inches from Vaughn's. "Please." Vaughn struggled against his grip, his face reddening, but he managed to choke out. 3 days. We fight at moonrise." Kaelin held him there a moment longer before releasing him with a shove. Vaughn stumbled toward the door, rubbing his throat, but his eyes were triumphant. He'd gotten what he wanted. As he reached the threshold, he looked back at Alara one last time. "When I win," he said, "the first thing I'll do is throw you out of this castle. You and whatever unnatural hold you have over those children." Then he was gone, and Alara could breathe again. Kaelin stood with his back to her, his shoulders heaving. She could see the tension in every line of his body, could practically feel the rage rolling off him in waves. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "You should go. Back to the nursery." "Kaelin." "Now, Alara." He still wouldn't look at her. "Before I do something we'll both regret." She wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, but the barely leashed violence in his tone stopped her. She fled, her borrowed dress whispering against the stone floors as she ran. Marta was waiting in the nursery, both boys sleeping peacefully in their cradles. She took one look at Alara's face and ushered her into the adjoining chamber. "You heard," Alara said. It wasn't a question. The whole castle heard. Marta's expression was grim. Vaughn's been waiting for an excuse like this. He was Lyanna's cousin, promised the throne before Kaelin came of age, and proved himself stronger. "He'll kill him." The words came out broken. "No." Marta's hands were gentle as she helped Alara out of the fine dress. "Kaelin is the strongest alpha in 5 generations. Vaughn is ambitious, but he's not suicidal. He's counting on Kaelin being weakened by grief." "Is he? Weakened?" Marta's silence was answer enough. The next 3 days were torture. Kaelin didn't come to the nursery. Alara cared for Torin and Ren alone, except for Marta's brief visits, and the boys seemed to sense something wrong. They cried more, slept less, their small faces scrunched in distress that broke her heart. On the second night, Alara woke to find Torin burning with fever. She pressed her hand to his forehead and felt panic claw up her throat. Too hot. Much too hot. She grabbed him from his cradle, barely noticing that Ren had started crying too, and ran. She didn't know where Kaelin's chambers were, but her feet seemed to, through corridors, upstairs, until she was pounding on a heavy oak door with her fist. It opened immediately. Kaelin stood there bare-chested, his hair loose around his shoulders, and the sight of him made something in her chest constrict painfully. "He's burning," she gasped, holding Torin out. "I don't know what to do." Kaelin took his son, his face draining of color as he felt the fever. "It's the shift," he said. "It happens sometimes in bloodlines this strong. His body is trying to change too early." "What do we do?" "We cool him down, fast." He was already moving, carrying Torin toward an adjoining room, where steam rose from what looked like a bathing pool. He stepped into the water, fully clothed, cradling Torin against his chest. Alara followed without thinking, the water soaking her nightgown instantly. She pressed close to Kaelin, her hands on Torin's small body, feeling the fever raging under his skin. "Talk to him," Kaelin said urgently. "Your voice calms him. We need him calm or the shift will tear him apart." So Alara sang, the same wordless lullaby she'd been singing since the first night, her voice shaking but steady. And slowly, so slowly, Torin's temperature began to drop. They stayed in the water until dawn, pressed together in the darkness, keeping Torin alive through sheer will. When the fever finally broke, Kaelin's forehead dropped against Alara's shoulder in relief. "Thank you," he breathed against her skin, and Alara realized with dawning horror that she would do anything, risk anything, to keep this man and his son safe, even if it destroyed her. They didn't speak as they climbed out of the water, their clothes clinging to their bodies in ways that should have been uncomfortable but felt inevitable. Kaelin wrapped Torin in warm blankets while Alara checked on Ren with Marta, who'd arrived sometime during the crisis. Both boys were safe now, sleeping peacefully. But Alara couldn't shake the terror that had clawed through her chest when Torin burned in her arms. Couldn't forget the way Kaelin's forehead had felt against her shoulder, the weight of his relief, the intimacy of shared fear. "You should rest," Kaelin said, his voice carefully neutral. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the pre-dawn light. "Tomorrow is the challenge," she forced the words out. "You're going to fight him." "I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice." She moved closer, her wet nightgown leaving puddles on the stone floor. "You could refuse. Step down. Take your son somewhere safe." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "And abandon my pack? My people? They need a strong alpha, Alara. Without leadership, the territory descends into chaos, into war. They need you alive." "They need me victorious." His jaw tightened. "Vaughn won't stop with taking my throne. He'll kill my sons to secure his claim. It's tradition. Old law." The world tilted. "No, he can't." "He can, and he will." Kaelin crossed to her in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders. "Which is why you need to listen to me. If I fall tomorrow, if Vaughn wins, you take the boys and run. There's a safe house 2 days north. Marta knows the way. You go there, and you don't look back." "I won't leave you." The words hung between them, too honest, too raw. Kaelin's grip on her shoulders tightened, his fingers digging in just enough to hurt. "You don't have a choice." "You keep saying that." Her voice shook with fury and fear and something deeper. "You keep telling me I don't have choices, but I do, Kaelin. And I choose to stay." "Why?" The question was torn from him. "Why would you risk everything for a man you barely know? For children that aren't yours?" "Because they feel like mine," she wanted to say. "Because when I hold them, I feel complete for the first time in my life. Because when you look at me, I feel seen in a way I've never been seen before." Instead, she said, "Because it's right." Kaelin made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. His hand slid from her shoulders to cup her face, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. "You're going to break my heart, Alara." "You don't have one to break." But the words came out gentle, almost teasing. "I didn't, until you." His thumb stroked across her cheekbone, and she felt the touch everywhere. "That first night, when I saw you holding my sons, something in me recognized you. Not as human, not even as pack, as mine." The air left her lungs. "Kaelin, I know it's impossible. I know you didn't ask for this. But the mate bond doesn't care about logic or timing or—" He stopped, closing his eyes. "I felt it the moment you touched me. And I've been fighting it ever since, because accepting it would mean admitting I could lose you before I ever really had you." Alara's hands came up to cover his, pressing them more firmly against her face. "Then don't fight it, not tonight." His eyes opened, molten gold in the dim light. "If I kiss you, I won't stop." "Good." The word was barely out before his mouth crashed against hers. It wasn't gentle, wasn't careful. It was desperation and hunger and 3 days of denial burning through them both. Alara gasped against his lips, and he swallowed the sound, his arms banding around her waist to pull her flush against him. She'd never been kissed before, never been held like this, like she was precious and necessary and utterly wanted. His mouth moved over hers with bruising intensity, and she met him with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his wet hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kaelin pressed his forehead to hers. "If I don't survive tomorrow." "You will." "But if I don't, I need you to know." His voice cracked. "I need you to know that these last days with you have been the only light in my darkness. You brought my sons back to life. You brought me back to life." Alara felt something shift inside her then, a cracking like ice breaking. And with it came a surge of heat, of power, of certainty. Her skin began to glow, actually glow, with a soft golden light. Kaelin jerked back, his eyes wide. Alara. I can help you. The knowledge bloomed in her chest, absolute and undeniable. Tomorrow, in the challenge. I don't know how I know, but I can. No. His voice was sharp. The challenge is sacred. One-on-one. If anyone interferes, I won't interfere, but I can give you strength. She grabbed his hands, pressing them to her chest where her heart hammered. Through the bond, if you accept it, if you claim me properly, you'll be stronger. Or it will weaken me more. But his eyes were locked on where her skin still glowed. You're manifesting. Your shifter nature is waking. Then wake with me. She pulled his hands to her lips, kissing his knuckles. Fight for us tomorrow, and win. Kaelin stared at her glowing skin as if seeing a miracle and a curse intertwined. You don't understand what you're offering. A claiming bond isn't gentle. It's permanent. And if I die tomorrow, you'll feel it. The severing will. I don't care. Alara stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. I don't care about the risk. Those boys need their father. And her voice broke. I need you to survive this. His resistance crumbled. She saw it happen, saw the moment his iron control snapped, and then his mouth was on hers again. But this kiss was different, slower, deeper, acclaiming in its own right. He walked her backward until her spine hit the wall, his body caging hers, and she felt the rumble in his chest that wasn't quite human. Tell me to stop, he murmured against her lips. Tell me this is too fast and I'll walk away. Don't you dare. His laugh was dark and wanting. You're going to ruin me. Promise? He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes searching hers. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him because he nodded once, sharp and final. Not here, not rushed. He took her hand, threading their fingers together. If we do this, we do it right. He led her to his chambers, a massive room dominated by a bed that could easily fit 4 people. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows across dark furs and rich fabrics. It smelled like him everywhere, that intoxicating mix of pine and smoke and wild things. Kaelin turned to face her, suddenly hesitant. He stopped, jaw working. Liana and I were arranged. Political. The bond never formed properly. It was duty, not... He couldn't finish. Not this, Alara supplied softly. Not this, he agreed. His hands were shaking as he reached for her. I don't want to hurt you. You won't. He drew her close, his fingers finding the laces of her still damp nightgown. Each pull of the ties was deliberate, giving her time to refuse. But Alara didn't refuse. She helped him, her own hands fumbling with his shirt until they were both skin against skin in the firelight. He was beautiful. Scarred and powerful and utterly masculine in a way that made her ache. When he lowered her onto his bed, she went willingly, pulling him down with her. The claiming mark, he said, his voice rough as gravel. His fingers traced the curve where her neck met her shoulder. It goes here, and it will hurt before it feels good. I trust you. Something in his expression broke at those words. He kissed her again, softer this time, reverent. His hands mapped her body like he was memorizing territory he'd fight wars to keep. And when his mouth traveled down her throat to that sensitive junction, she felt her entire body tense in anticipation. This will bind us, he warned one last time. Are you certain? Yes. His teeth pierced her skin, and pain exploded through her nervous system, sharp and bright and overwhelming. She cried out, her fingers digging into his shoulders, but he held her steady. And then the pain shifted, transformed into something else entirely. Pleasure cascaded through her in waves, each one stronger than the last, until she was trembling and gasping his name like a prayer. Through the haze, she felt him in her mind. Not thoughts exactly, but emotions. His fear for his sons, his rage at Vaughn, his bone-deep exhaustion. and underneath it all, a fierce, protective love directed entirely at her. When he finally pulled back, his lips stained with her blood, his eyes were completely gold, no whites, just molten fire. "Mine," he growled, and the word resonated in her bones. "Yours," she agreed, and then, surprising them both, "But you're mine too." He shuddered, his forehead dropping to her unmarked shoulder. "Always." They lay tangled together as dawn broke fully, neither willing to move. Alara could feel the bond thrumming between them now, a living connection that pulsed with shared heartbeats. She could sense his strength, vast and ancient, and underneath it, the wound that Lyanna's death had left. "I loved her," Kaelin said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Maybe he could. But not like this. This is different, Alara finished. She turned in his arms to face him. "What happens now?" "Now I fight." His hand came up to trace the mark on her neck, already healed, already silvered into a permanent scar. "And I win. Because losing isn't an option anymore." The day passed too quickly. Marta brought food they barely touched. The boys woke and were fed and soothed. Kaelin held his sons for long minutes, whispering promises in that ancient language Alara was starting to understand. As sunset approached, he stood at the window watching the sky turn crimson. "It's time." Alara rose, her hand instinctively going to the mark at her neck. Through the bond, she could feel his determination, his focus. But also his fear, not of death, but of leaving them unprotected. "I'll be watching," she said. "And I'll be sending you everything I have." He turned to her one last time, pulling her against him for a kiss that tasted like goodbye and forever all at once. "When this is over, I'm marrying you properly. Pack ceremony, the full ritual." "When this is over," she corrected, "I'm going to say yes." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his face, and then he was gone, heading toward the challenge grounds where Vaughn waited. Alara followed at a distance, her heart in her throat. The entire pack had gathered in a massive clearing ringed with torches. Vaughn stood at the center, already shifted, a massive brown wolf with amber eyes and teeth like daggers. Kaelin entered the circle, and the crowd fell silent. Then he shifted, and Alara's breath stopped. His wolf was enormous, black as midnight with those same impossible gold eyes. Power radiated off him in waves. An elder stepped forward, speaking the ritual words. And then, with a howl that shook the earth, Vaughn attacked. The two wolves collided with the force of an avalanche. Teeth and claws flashed in the torchlight as they tore at each other, their snarls echoing through the clearing. Blood sprayed across the dirt. Whose? Alara couldn't tell. Vaughn was fast, striking like a snake, his teeth finding purchase in Kaelin's shoulder. Kaelin twisted, throwing Vaughn off, but not before deep gouges appeared in his black fur. Through the bond, Alara felt his pain like it was her own, sharp and burning and fueling her panic. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat sync with his, and pushed. Strength, certainty, love, everything she had, flooding through their connection. Kaelin's head snapped toward her for a fraction of a second, his golden eyes finding hers across the crowd. And then he moved with renewed ferocity, his jaws closing around Vaughn's back leg with a sickening crunch. Vaughn howled in pain and rage, spinning to rake his claws down Kaelin's side. More blood. Too much blood. Alara could feel Kaelin weakening, feel the grief and exhaustion dragging at him like chains. No, she wouldn't let him fall. Not when she just found him. The glow started in her chest again, that golden light that marked her awakening. It spread down her arms, into her hands, and without thinking, she thrust her palms forward. Light shot from her in a beam of pure energy, striking Kaelin's wolf form. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted about interference, but the light didn't harm Kaelin. It sank into him, melding with his own power, amplifying it. His form seemed to grow larger, his eyes blazing brighter, and when he roared, the sound was thunder and fury combined. He hit Vaughn like a battering ram, teeth finding throat. Vaughn struggled, thrashing desperately, but Kaelin's jaws were locked. It was over in moments. Vaughn's wolf went limp, his submission clear in every line of his body. Kaelin could have killed him, should have, by the old laws. Instead, he released Vaughn with a final shake and shifted back to human form, standing naked and bloody in the center of the circle. "I am your Alpha," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the clearing. "I am your king, and any who challenge that will face the same mercy I've shown tonight. One chance to bend the knee or die." Vaughn shifted back, cradling his mangled leg, his face twisted with hatred and humiliation, but he lowered his head in submission. "My king," he forced out through clenched teeth. The pack erupted in howls, not ceremonial this time, but wild and victorious. Kaylin's eyes found Alara through the chaos, and the look in them made her knees weak. Pride, relief, possession. He crossed to her in long strides, seemingly unconcerned by his nakedness or his wounds, and pulled her against him. His lips found the mark on her neck, and pleasure shot through her so intensely she gasped. "Mine," he growled against her skin, loud enough for the pack to hear. "My mate, my Luna." The howls intensified. An elder approached with ceremonial robes, which Kaylin shrugged into before turning back to the assembled pack. His arm was iron around Alara's waist, holding her against his side. "This woman saved my sons when they were dying," he announced. "She awakened her shifter blood in service to this pack. She gave me strength when I needed it most, and I claim her now, before the moon and the pack, as my true mate." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "If she'll have me." Alara's throat was tight with emotion, but she managed to speak clearly. "I will." The pack's approval was deafening. Marta appeared with the twins, both awake and alert, and Kaylin took Torin while Alara held Ren. They stood together in the center of the circle, a family forged from tragedy and necessity and something far stronger than either. "My Luna," Kaylin said quietly, his lips brushing her temple. "My light in the darkness." "My Alpha," she replied, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. "My home." That night, after his wounds were tended and the boys were sleeping peacefully, Kaylin carried Alara back to his chambers. Their chambers now. He laid her down on furs and silk, his touch reverent, and showed her without words what it meant to be cherished. When he moved over her, his eyes glowing gold in the darkness, she felt complete for the first time in her life. Not invisible, not forgotten, but chosen, claimed, beloved. "I love you," he whispered against her lips as they moved together. "I loved you from the moment you held my sons and made them whole." "I love you," she gasped back, pleasure building between them like a storm. "I'll love you until the moon falls from the sky." The bond flared bright as they fell together, their souls intertwining as thoroughly as their bodies. And in that moment, Alara understood what she'd been searching for her entire life. Not invisibility, but belonging. Not survival, but home. 6 months later, Alara stood at the window of the royal chambers, watching snow fall over the northern mountains. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach, still small enough to hide under her gown, but unmistakable to those who knew where to look. Kaylin knew. He'd known before she did, his nose picking up the change in her scent before her body had shown any other signs. The joy on his face when he told her had been worth every moment of uncertainty that had brought them here. Behind her, she heard the nursery door open and turned to see Marta leading Torin and Ren inside. The boys were walking now, stumbling really, but determined in that way only children possessed. They saw her and squealed in delight, their arms reaching up.
"Mama!"
Torin shouted, the word still clumsy on his tongue but perfect to her ears. Alara scooped them both up despite her growing belly, pressing kisses to their dark curls. They smelled like milk and mischief, and their small hands patted her face with the casual affection of children who'd never known a moment without love. "Your father will be home soon," she told them, and felt the truth of it through the bond. Kaylin was close, riding back from a border negotiation that had ended peacefully thanks to his new reputation. The Alpha King who'd claimed a dormant shifter and made her his Luna. The king who ruled with strength tempered by compassion. The king who was hers. She heard his footsteps before his arrival, the bond humming with his proximity. When he entered, snow still dusting his hair, his eyes went immediately to her. They always did. That golden gaze that had once terrified her now felt like coming home. "My love," he murmured, crossing to her in 3 long strides. He kissed her deeply, uncaring that his sons were watching and giggling, then dropped to one knee to press his lips to her stomach. "And my little warrior." "You think it's a girl?" Alara asked, running her fingers through his hair. "I know it is." He looked up at her with such tenderness it stole her breath. "And she'll be as fierce as her mother." The boys squirmed to be put down, immediately toddling toward their toys. Kaylin rose, pulling Alara against him, his arms banding around her waist from behind. They stood together watching their sons play, and Alara felt the peace of it settle deep. "Do you ever regret it?" Kaylin asked quietly. "That night I gave you no choice." "Every day," she said, and felt him stiffen before she continued. "I regret that I wasted even one moment fighting what we were meant to be." His laugh was soft against her ear. "You going to spoil me with words like that?" "Good. You deserve to be spoiled." They stood in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the boys babbling to each other in their secret twin language. Through the window, Alara could see the pack going about their evening routines, families gathering, children playing, the simple rhythms of life in a territory at peace, her territory now, her pack. It still amazed her sometimes how completely her life had transformed. The invisible servant girl was now Luna Queen, mother to the heirs, mate to the most powerful alpha in the north. But more than titles or status, she'd found what she'd been searching for without knowing: purpose, family, love. "What are you thinking?" Kaylin murmured, his hand splaying possessively over her stomach. "That I was just a servant calming crying babies," she said softly. "I had no idea they were the Alpha King's sons. No idea that saving them would save me too." Kaylin turned her in his arms, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You didn't save them, love. You saved all of us." He pressed his forehead to hers. "You saved me." Torin chose that moment to toddle over, grabbing his father's leg with sticky hands.
Papa, up!
Kaylin laughed and scooped up his son, then reached for Ren with his other arm. Alara pressed close, completing their circle, and felt the bond pulse with contentment. This was her life now. Not perfect. They still faced challenges, still navigated the complexities of pack politics and parenthood. But it was hers. Theirs, built on a foundation of trust and passion, and a love that had bloomed in the most impossible circumstances. "Mama sing?" Ren asked, his golden eyes, so like his father's, pleading. So Alara sang the lullaby that had started everything, her voice wrapping around her family like a blessing. Kaylin's eyes glowed as he watched her, and through the bond, she felt what he felt: wonder, gratitude, forever. When the boys finally fell asleep in their arms, Kaylin carried them to their cradles, then returned to pull Alara toward their bed. His touch was gentle but heated, promising long hours of pleasure ahead. "I love you," he whispered as he lowered her onto silk and furs. "My Luna, my everything." "I love you," she replied, pulling him down to her. "My Alpha, my home." And as the snow fell soft outside their window and the fire burned low in the hearth, Alara finally understood the deepest truth of all. She had been invisible once, forgotten and alone. But Kaylin had seen her. His sons had chosen her. And in doing so, they'd given her the one thing she'd never dared hope for: a place to belong, a future bright with promise, a love that would last until the moon itself fell dark. She was home.